Hello guys, Mr. Mawson here. I'm going to do a recorded video lecture for Unit 10. So hopefully you guys can view this over the weekend. This will be somewhat helpful. It's going to be basically what we went over on Wednesday this past week, but a little bit slower pace. So we'll try to slow things down a little bit, but I am going to stay more focused again with this lecture. There's a lot of stuff here in this chapter and even in reproductive that are really useful, but we want to kind of keep it concise as best we can because it's so fast paced here at the end. But you guys are doing well. You're surviving. Hang in there. So yeah. So chapter 20, fluid, electrolyte, and acid base balance. This starts on page 407 in our book. So we're going to kind of get into it from there. I can find my right buttons here. Okay. So the biggest thing is this first part of this chapter talks a lot about fluid balance. So most of our body is water. Between male and females a little bit different. Males, whatever. But if you average about 60%, 65%, somewhere in that range, 60% in the middle would be all people are made of body. So we can break that down into two main we can break that down. Excuse me, guys. Basically, we can break down the fluid in our body, okay, right, to two essential compartments, right? Fluid compartments. So one is ICF, intracellular fluid, ICF, okay? That's our big section here. Most of the body's water resides inside the cells, so that's the 65%. The other 35% is outside of cells, okay? So this includes interstitial fluid, which is just talking about any fluid that is not in a cell, that's kind of in between tissues, that sort of thing. Mainly interstitial fluid. We're talking about the fluid that makes up the in between the layers of our membranes, like our pleura, pericardium, peritoneum, those kind of membranes around organs or compartments of our body. Plasma is talking about what makes blood, the liquid part of blood. Plasma, that's also extra outside the cell. Lymph and small part of that, and transcellular fluids, just talking about any fluid that's kind of in transition from outside the cell to one of these places mainly. But that's about 35%. So if I asked you again, where's most of our fluid in our body is comprised of either ICF inside the cell or ECF, extracellular fluid, extra being E, exit outside the cell, ICF, intracellular, I for inside the cell. Okay, right? Some other kind of extracellular fluids would be like cerebrospinal fluid, CSF, synovial fluid that's in our joints, if you remember that. Vitreous aqueous humor, that's a part of our eye. Digestive secretions themselves would all kind of be considered extracellular fluid in this branch. Okay. And this is talked about here. Also, if you look at on the first page, at 407 page, first page of this chapter, the fast fact in there does talk about as far as our body weight, men typically are more water than women, about 55 to 60%. It makes sense if you think about women have higher fat deposits related to their body makeup, body chemistry, and for childbearing. So women tend to be more, and also that makes sense too that as we age, we tend to be less water, or if someone's morbidly obese, they're actually less water because fat itself is not very water soluble. So it doesn't really fill up with water like other components, other cells. Okay. Newborn infants, though, are very fresh out, very lots of cells moving and growing and doing mitosis. So they're higher water percentage, like 75%. I think the biggest thing to know from there is just say, if I asked you, is a woman or a man made up of more body or more water, H2O, you'd say a woman. Or excuse me, see, I said it backwards. You would say a man has more water percentage of his body versus a woman because of the fat deposit. Same thing for obese and that sort of thing. So that's all the difference it's trying to make you, is that you kind of have that concept of how much of a person is made up of water. Next page, 408, we kind of get into, there's a discussion about this, which is osmolarity. Okay. Don't stress about osmolarity too much. Basically, this is talking about, osmolarity is talking about like concentration. I'm trying to spell here. Concentration. Okay. You remember that word. How many solutes are in a solution? And again, you're going to see a video shortly, and we watched it in class, but we as humans are not the problem. We're the solution. We're a solution. We're basically like a cup of water, and we have a certain amount of minerals, salts, potassium, anything you can think of that either increases or decreases our osmolarity. And we remember from our basic principles we learned about in the first unit of like diffusion across the cell wall, And osmosis, water wants to kind of try and follow salt, or wants to try and follow really any mineral to equalize us, right? To keep us balanced. So water's going to move out of the cell, concentration rises. If osmolarity is down, meaning this is more liquid, this is like a higher amount of water with smaller amounts of molecules, versus inside the cell, it's got a whole bunch. It's thicker. It's more molecules. Water will flow that way, and that's kind of the balance there. Basically, is what that's saying. Okay, so don't stress about that too much. What I would highlight from that section, and we'll talk about in a second. So first question we could ask is, okay, just refreshing us already. What determines the amount or direction of fluid that flows between body compartments? And what do you think here? Concentration, pH, concentration of solutes, the volume of the fluid in one of the compartments. I'll give you a hint. You guys already know this. We just said this with osmosis and our movement of osmolarity, fluid movement, right? Okay. Concentration of solute. So that's going to determine the flow of water, whether we're going in the cell, out of the cell. Concentration of solutes. Water wants to osmosis and equalize it. Okay. Again, none of the other factors influence. The bottom of page 408's got this chart here. Again, really what this is saying, if I just talk to you about, you don't necessarily have to memorize this number, that or sort of thing, but just know that drinking fluid comes from our food. Other ways, our body making some liquid and moving some liquid around. That's where our intake is. Our output is used up in skin, perspiration, breathing, a lot of urine output. I mean, that's where we lose it. So you just think this is the homeostasis part of our body with fluid balance. Our body's going to try to balance our amount of fluid we get out by how much we take in. So if we don't have a day where we don't drink a lot of water, we're running around a lot, right? Our pee or our urine is going to look more concentrated and more yellow instead of clear, because right, our body is trying to retain water and we don't pee as much. So that makes sense when you think about it that way as far as urine output. So again, we're talking about just the body wants to maintain homeostasis. So no matter what, if I ever asked you about fluid balance and homeostasis, our body's always going to try to equal out whatever we take in is whatever our output's going to be. Okay. This is talking about that chart that's on page 409 where it talks about regulation of intake and output. Don't concern yourself too much with this. This is just kind of give us a picture, a snapshot of the hypothalamus as it reads, our fluid amount, and either tells us, hey, get thirsty and drink some water, or hey, you're a little bit overhydrated, so you're okay. You don't need to drink any water. We need to make sure we're making urine, that sort of thing. Okay. And that's what that's talking about. Kind of the balance for a hypothalamus is how it balances this homeostasis of fluid loss versus fluid gain. And there's also an interesting fact that elderly patients have kind of a diminished sensation of thirst anyway. So that's why they intend to be more dehydrated, a combination with them lacking as much of a balance or percentage of their body being water canonical, which is interesting at that fast fact at the bottom of 409, but I'm not going to stress you out for the test, but it's interesting. Okay. Moving on. So then this is that other half of that chart from page 408 or 409, excuse me. So this is just going back to our hormones, to our kidney hormone, ADH. Again, anti-diuretic. Again, diuretic means what? Diurese, right? Get rid of excess amounts of fluid through urine. So anti is always antagonistic against whatever. So it's doing the opposite of diuresing. So anti-diuretic hormone wants to retain water, wants to do the opposite of getting rid of a bunch of water in urine. How does it do that? Well, it's trying to get rid of water. So, was it stimulate the thirst center, prompts the kidneys to excrete more water, it produces dry mouth, or it prompts the kidneys to reabsorb more water? What do you think? And you guys were thinking number 4. You're correct. And again, with these questions, right? I'm not going to wait that long. I want to make the video somewhat. So if you're like, I want to think about it for a second before I answer, just pause it. But the answer is it prompts the kidneys to reabsorb water. Specifically, if you remember from urinary, targeting the collecting ducts of that all the nephrons join to kind of make that final say of how concentrated our urine is going to be by how much water we reabsorb. And ADH is doing that specifically. And this is your rationale. Again, ADH prompts kidneys to reabsorb more water, produce less urine. The other stuff is, again, thirst center, hypothalamus, salvage secretion. These are all related to changes in decline in total water volume. So disorders of the water balance is talked about on page 410. I'm not going to focus on this too much. Again, I think it's interesting talking about dehydration in general. We're not having enough water, right? The body of work section there talks about skin turgor and what tenting is, and you'll be checking skin turgor when you do an assessment as a nurse. So I think I'd put a little highlight there as interesting. I don't necessarily going to focus on that on your exam, but I think it's good to know. Okay. But again, turgor's talking about if you right now grab your hand and the not the palm side, but the back side of your hand, put it up, grab it, right? I'm doing it now. If you can imagine me doing it, you grab it and you kind of pinch it. If it snaps back pretty quickly, okay, you're fairly well hydrated. If it stays up, that's called tenting. If it stays up and takes a little bit longer to snap back into place, that would mean you're dehydrated a bit, okay? So that's just what that's talking about. There's also a nice picture here of dehydration as far as like losing. Okay, this is H2, water loss, and sweat. It's like this chain reaction. We're losing water because we're sweating a bunch. Like imagine you're working out, right? Fluid from the bloodstream tries to help. It's going to swift out of the bloodstream to give these ducts and these glands something fluid again to help kind of cool us off. And that means that the fluid is going to shift along that factor because because now the concentration is higher, osmolarity, right? There's more parts in the blood plasma, so fluid shifts out of the interstitial tissue here, which means that it's going to keep pulling fluid out of the cells, right? This is where dehydration is. So I think it's an interesting snapshot. It'd be a good thing to look at as a reference point if it helps you kind of understand how we compensate or what fluid balance, what we're talking about with dehydration, but not going to stress you out necessarily about, oh, you have to memorize this, right? Okay, so moving on. So this is a good video. What I will do is, again, I have to kind of overlay this and edit it. So right now I'm just going to say, all right, pause the video, put this full screen. I'm going to play it now, and then we'll come back right after the video is done.
Trust it.
Hey everybody, Dr. O here. Welcome to our unit on fluid, electrolyte, and acid-base balance. So I'm just going to introduce why those three things are important today. So here you see water, right? I mean, water is so important. If water wasn't water, life wouldn't exist. That's the way that I look at it. Water has life-giving properties, not just for us, but the biological world around us. I like to say that life takes place in water. But there's a lot of water in you. Somewhere in the ballpark of 60% of your body weight is water, depending on age, etc. But water isn't the only thing there. So another thing I like to say, a little bit cliche here, but you are not a problem, right? You are a solution. So a solution is going to be a solvent, and water is the universal solvent in the human body. So one solvent, water, plus one or more solutes. So the other ingredients that make you up are going to be the solutes that are in this solution. So if you think, that's one way to look at it, is you are a solution. So what are these solutes and why they matter so much? So fluid balance is, can we balance our water gains with our water losses? That's great. We have to have the right amount of water in our body. But the solutes in our body, not only do they have their own functions, but they play a huge role in where this water is. So some of these solutes are going to be like your proteins that can transport hormones and all sorts of things. You've got other macronutrients, carbohydrates, etc. Then we have electrolytes. So electrolyte balance is, do you have the right number of electrolytes and are they in the right location to help determine where this body water is? So as I cover in another video, you're about 60% of your body water is intracellular fluid and the other 40% is extracellular fluid. Well, it's electrolytes and other solvents that determine where these things are. So we'll talk about electrolyte balance as far as primarily the role it plays with where your body fluid is. We really can't boss water around. Water moves by osmosis, so we have to change where solutes are so water will follow it. That's the simplest way to look at it. So fluid balance is important. Electrolyte balance determines where that fluid is, and then none of this matters if we can't maintain a normal pH. So think about like your blood pH is normally 7.35 to 7.45. If you can't maintain a pH range, if your pH gets too low or too high, proteins denature, your cells fall apart, and you die. So the pH of these fluids is also going to matter a big deal, which is why we'll cover the acid-base balance as well. Here we see back to fluid balance. I mean, you are mostly water. Somewhere between 50 and 60% water, depending on fat versus muscle. When you're younger, it's even higher, like 75%. as you get older, it can even get down to like 45%. We kind of shrivel up as we get older, basically. But the fluid numbers, I generally just say 50 to 60% water. But a man or someone with more lean tissue like muscle would be closer to 60%. Someone with more fat would be a lower number, closer to 50%. Here you see just different examples. Some of your fluids, like look at your brain and your kidneys here, they're both 80 to 85% water, whereas your teeth only have a little tiny bit of water in them. But usually and bones are gonna not have very much water either. So your body's made of water, but of course different amounts in different places. So that's fluid balance. We've already talked about. So how do you keep all this water in your body? I covered this in another video, but you balance your gains with your losses. So simply put, you drink water, eat water, and you make water. Your metabolism does generate about a cup of water a day. How do you lose it? Well, you pee it out, you micturate or urinate, you sweat it out, and you breathe it out. And then, of course, feces is going to lose some water, and hopefully not too much. So we have to. The electrolytes are gonna determine where this water goes. We've talked about this. Last thing here with this introduction is just why is it so important to help maintain pH, or why is it so difficult? Every second of every day, your body is generating acids. So the waste products of your metabolism are acids. So we are kind of always teetering on this edge of our pH dropping too low and us getting sick or succumbing, dying from it. So you have buffers and you have systems in place that constantly deal with these acids. And this is why if someone does have an acid-base disturbance, it's almost always an acidosis, because our metabolism is pushing us that direction anyways. If we don't constantly maintain a normal pH with buffers, our kidneys, and our lungs, then we're in trouble. Okay, so that's just a real brief introduction to the three main topics we're going to cover in this unit: fluid balance, electrolyte balance, and acid-base balance. I hope this helps. Have a wonderful day. Be blessed.
Okay, I'm going to move on from the video. Very good video, though. I like the way, again, we are a solution, not the problem as humans, right? Before we move to electrolyte balance, on page 411, it discusses fluid excess, water intoxication. I'm not too concerned about knowing that. Fluid accumulation down there is mainly talking about edema, okay? Again, homeostasis gets a little bit out of whack for whatever reason. If there's a disease process happening, that's where edema comes from. When our legs swell, when the fluid shifts out of cells into interstitial tissue, interstitial space, and now it swells up, and that's edema. So this can affect anything from, like, again, legs, arms, dependent areas like ascites, fluid buildup in the stomach, or lungs, brain, can be kind of anywhere. So there's a number of things that any shifts in those, like, interstitial compartments, the compartments outside of cells, can kind of do that. Movement of electrolytes, plasma proteins. Again, osmosis is going to follow stuff. Salt sucks. Protein, especially plasma proteins that are floating through plasma, also suck. Predominantly, fluid's going to follow them. Okay. So electrolyte balance. This starts being discussed on page 411 towards the second half, bottom of the page. Again, I think the biggest highlight from this is, like, I'm not going to stress you out about knowing everything, but some of these chemical names for things are pretty important to kind of have a general, like, if you look at it, you'll know what we're talking about. For example, things like, let's see, the major cations and anions. I'm not too concerned about cations and anions, and I always say that wrong anyway. That's more chemistry related, but what you want to be thinking about, of course, is sodium, potassium are big two electrolytes that we're going to discuss shortly. Calcium, you guys should mostly know what calcium is related to, what happens without it. And then the hydrogen ions play a hugest role of utmost importance in the pH balance of our body. The other one's chloride, bicarb, okay, and phosphates kind of play the antagonist to these molecules in a way, especially hydrogen ions. Let me annotate. And bicarb, HCO3. Those two have a inverse relationship. So one's going up, one's going down, and they can kind of counteract each other. Same thing here. Usually sodium and potassium generally have an inverse relationship. Not always, but generally. But especially bicarb. Bicarb can cancel out hydrogen, okay, and kind of vice versa. So that's a good thing to keep in mind. That's why it's important to kind of know these chemical names at an offhand glance. Electrolyte concentrations. There's a nice chart there. That's a good reference point. Really, it's talking about normal blood plasma ranges of all the big electrolytes. I'm not too concerned about that for you guys. You guys will get that as you get into the program. So I'm not going to make you memorize those ranges. So don't necessarily get too concerned with that. You can kind of breeze over that. Okay. Here's where we want to be. So sodium here, right? Sodium. That is our major, and this starts on page 412 where we start talking about sodium and its imbalances. But the biggest pull from this for this chapter and for what you want to know is the main electrolyte in extracellular fluid. Again, right? ECF, exit outside cells, extracellular fluid. This is the main electrolyte you're going to find out there, okay? Determines the volume of total body water. What that's saying is, again, right? Salt sucks. Sodium is salt. Salt sucks, okay? So that's where body water will follow. And it's the same thing with distribution. Plays a key role in depolarization, okay? The biggest thing, again, I mentioned this before, is that you're going to think nerve, okay? Nerve impulse, like the electrical signal, and muscle function, especially skeletal muscle. But both of these play with it. So nerve impulses, that's supposed to be an R and a V, but, you know, it's kind of hard to write with this thing. Nerve, muscle. I don't have a tablet to write on. I'm not fancy yet. One day, maybe. So the biggest thing is, like, you don't even necessarily have to know. I don't even care at this point, really, if you know what symptoms somebody's going to have of hypernatremia, hyper being high, right? Or hypo being low, natremia. Natremia, you can always remember neutrimia as hypo and hyper, right? We know those. Na, NAT is, you know, Na is the chemical name for sodium. So natremia, Na, and then emia is blood. So low sodium blood levels, hyponatremia. So you can kind of break down words, and you get that with medical terminology in first trimester, and it helps. But biggest thing is say main ECF electrolyte. Hear me here, right? Main ECF electrolyte, sodium. Helps with influences of where water is distributed in the body. Really important for nerve impulse, electrical impulses, and muscle contraction. Okay. Bam. You got all you need to know for us for sodium, right? And this is just talking about, again, the process is discussed on page 412 of when sodium kind of drops in a water excess or water deficit in our body. And this has to do with, again, osmolarity and concentration. This can kind of confuse you. This is that higher level of connecting all of the, you know, water balance, electrolyte balance with hormones that you've learned before. So you can graze over that chart, but if you read through that chart and it confuses you, don't stress about it. I'm not focusing on that for you guys right now. Okay. But it's there. So basically what it's saying is that, hey, serum osmolality is low, which, right, if you remember, osmolarity means that it's more concentrated. Decreased osmolarity means it's more concentrated. So there's more sodium. Okay. So basically what it's trying to do is kind of, so this means that it's more concentrated in the cells, right? Or serum, excuse me, outside the cell is more or less concentrated. And what it's trying to do is raise the sodium levels back up. Okay. Excuse me, osmolarity meaning that it's more liquid. Sorry. And osmolarity is the opposite, always throws me off. Less osmolarity means that it's more watery, okay, in the bloodstream, and what that's saying. And then we go the other way. What it's saying is that, okay, that's going to help ADH and aldosterone increase sodium, hold on to water. Excuse me. I'm messing it up now that I'm talking about it. Listen, just, you know what? Just like like we're in a court here, you know, witnesses disregard what I just said. Just get rid of it. Okay. We're not going to worry about it. Just disregard it. Forget what you heard, witnesses. Move on. We're in court now. Potassium. That's on the next page, or on page 413. Okay, potassium. Big things for potassium. I don't care about the range. Oh, see, this is the normal sodium range. Big thing for potassium. Don't care about the range or anything. Here's your big thing. Okay, chief is just same thing as saying like main, just like our main extracellular ion or molecule that we care about for electrolytes is sodium. Our main intracellular, right? I for intracellular, ICF, I for inside, I for intracellular fluid. Main one is potassium, which its chemical is this, like K for K. Okay. Okay. It works kind of hand to hand with sodium. They have like this balance between each other. Again, nerve function, muscle function. Here's the big one though, right? The heart. If you hear anything about potassium, you think any out of whack potassium equals heart possibility of heart arrhythmias, and I can't hardly spell arrhythmias, and I'm trying to do it with my mouse, and it's going to be terrible. That's not too bad. Okay, heart arrhythmias. All right, that's what you're concerned about. That talks about fast fat potassium imbalances are most dangerous of any electrolyte. Okay, imbalance. Very high levels are considered life-threatening emergencies, medical emergencies. So these are the most dangerous out of balance because, well, it has a small serum balance, so it doesn't take long to get out of whack. And then secondarily, it's really potential for heart arrhythmias, which if you have any other comorbidities, I mean, any other disease process going on, you're at risk for some problems. So you don't want your potassium out of balance. Life-threatening arrhythmias, and that's mentioned here in the next slide when it talks about ranges. Again, ranges can dictate on what facility you work at, what book you're even reading. So don't stress about the ranges. I'm not going to test you on ranges. Generally, just have an idea of if potassium's out of whack either way, I'm concerned about that because that's a big thing, a theme that comes up again and again and again and again and again in nursing. Okay. Potassium out of whack, cardiac arrhythmias. Calcium and calcium imbalance is discussed on the top of page 414. Don't stress about it. That's all I'm going to say. Don't stress about it. You're okay. Calcium, we know muscle contraction, nerve, and blood clotting is kind of like that weird extra one that people forget. Parathyroid, PTH hormone is important to helping regulate it. But as far as playing any role in influencing our blood pressure, because potassium calcium is no influence on that. So we're not going to stress about it. I can stress about it for electrolyte balances right now. Now there are, remember, hyper and hypercalcemia. We've already talked about some specific things of that when we talked about endocrine that you should remember, hopefully. But for this, we're not going to focus on so much the physiology of different imbalances. I just want to have that these are important and kind of why, right? So another main question as a recap here from what we've already seen. Okay, what's the main cation of electrical, or main cation or cation, however you want to say it. Main cation or electrolyte of extracellular fluid. Is it potassium, sodium, chloride, or calcium? And I'm going to pause it if you need a second. Answer is potassium. Oh, haha. See, I got myself extracellular. See, I messed myself up. Extracellular is outside the cell, sodium. So if I said, what's the main ion of intracellular fluid inside the cells? Boom, that would be potassium, right? Tricking myself over here. Trying to go too fast, and it's already like 9 something at night. So hang in there with me, guys. Okay. Acid-base balance is discussed at the bottom of page 414, right? So this is a pretty big important factor influence in homeostasis of our body, but pH is always, this is the range, and you're just going to have to memorize the range. There's really no way around it, but you might as well do it now because it's going to be so helpful for you in the future. Again, 7.35 to 7.45, okay? That is, and slight deviations can be fatal. This is the normal range of blood pH for humans, okay? Again, if it gets too far out of whack, even by small minutes, basically the enzymes in the body don't get created. The reactions are very, like enzymes reactions are sensitive to pH. Cell mitosis is sensitive. Cell metabolic activity, very sensitive to pH. So if pH gets out of whack, when cells die and things just get rough quickly. So anything out of whack can lead to death not far. Anywhere from under 7.2, anything above 7.5 is going to be causing some symptoms, right? So what this is say, okay, what is this range of? You just think pH, right, is all related to high or low hydrogen ions. How much hydrogen I have, okay? Now it's got an opposite effect with this number, with this physical number that represents pH of something, okay? If I have a lot of hydrogen ions, my pH is inverse. The pH number goes down. The opposite, if I have decreased amount of balance of hydrogen ions, my pH number will go up, okay? I'm gonna write pH here. So if, for example, if I had increased hydrogen ions, that means my pH might be more like 7.29 or something. Okay. Decrease hydrogen ions, it might be 7.49. Okay. Does that make sense? It's confusing, but it is opposite. You want to think that pH and acidity, because hydrogen is super toxic, okay, super acidic, okay. So wherever hydrogen goes, it's going to bring down the pH and make things more acidic. For example, kind of give you an idea of like kind of neutral, like pH for gastric contents. If you imagine, just give you an idea of pH is like, I really can't remember off the top of my head. I meant to look this up. I apologize. We'll just say 3.5, really acidic. Okay. That's why it hurts your stomach when you have acid reflux and stuff. It's not supposed to be there. So gastric secretions like stomach acid, hydrochloric acid, 3.5. Neutral kind of ground would be like water, just plain old water out of the tap, whatever, would be like a 5. Okay. And so we as humans operate on this high end scale, so leaning towards alkaline of 7.35 to 7.45. Does that make more sense? So as closer it gets to acidic, right, the more problems we're going to have. Okay. So again, for pH, as a recap, you think related to hydrogen ions. So if I have more hydrogen ions, less hydrogen ions, I'm going to have an out of balance pH. Hydrogen ions are very acidic. So the more I have, like, you're physically holding more, I'm going to be a lower pH, more acidic. Less hydrogen ions, I'm going to be more what's called alkaline. So again, acid, and that's alkaline is also basic or base. That's where the acid base balance comes from. Base is synonymous with the word alkaline. Okay. So base alkaline is higher on the pH scale, acidic is lower, and this is the range just for humans. Again, here this is still like, this would be way more base or alkaline than water we are, but that's because of all the other components we have going on in our body. Gastric contents, right? Super acidic, way more hydrogen ions compared to us as people, right? Okay. Hope that's making sense. So page 415 talks about, okay, well, what do we do with this information, right? What does this mean? How's our body maintain homeostasis? Again, we talked about water balance, electrolyte balance. Again, all our body trying to maintain homeostasis. All right, fair enough, right? How does our body do that? Well, our book gives us some pretty specific examples. So I was just taking a drink. The big thing, as I mentioned already before, bicarbonate here is HCO3, okay? HCO3. This is bicarb. Bicarb is part of the chemical buffer system, but because it can help bind it can help disassociate. It can basically help disassociate hydrogen ions, okay? Because bicarb is a byproduct of hydrogen ions getting combined with CO2. When bicarb is produced, it can I'll hold on some bicarb because bicarb is B for bicarb is very much more basic or alkaline than hydrogen. So you think hydrogen ions are very acidic, you think bicarb is like basic, like a basic, B word, girl, okay? Basic is, we're talking about base. I'm supposed to write alkaline. I started writing very base alkaline. That's what bicarb is. So we'll come back to bicarb, but chemical buffers is our first line of defense. Okay. As far as maintain, again, we're talking about methods our body does to maintain pH balance or homeostasis. Okay. Maintaining the balance. This is our first system. We use some bicarb, and that's product of breaking down components of water and CO2 and stuff like that to help kind of get rid of the hydrogen ions, counteract the hydrogen ions, phosphate and protein buffer systems. I'm not too concerned that each of these systems, like how they work. And the book gives us an example of how each three of basically bicarb, phosphate, and protein buffer systems connect. It's all about chemistry, basically, when them binding to hydrogen ions to make it a weak acid, base that acid, girl, kind of thing. Okay. Make that acid basic, not toxic, but basic. Okay. That's what they're doing. The biggest thing I want you to think about is just the chemical buffers. If I say, hey, first line of defense for keeping our pH or maintaining a balance of our pH, right, is chemical buffers, this system. That's all you need to really think about. Chemical buffers. And know that it happens in like seconds. So like as soon as our body pH gets out of whack by like a tenth of a pH scale, boom, seconds happen, chemicals react, they release, help to bind to hydrogen ions, make it a little bit less acidic in our body, boom, pH regulates within seconds, right? Okay. That's the first kind of line of defense to maintain homeostasis for our pH balance. So you just think buffer systems, don't necessarily have to know all the specifics of like how bicarb does it, how phosphate, how protein does it. That's all chemical, chemistry related and good to know. But for right now, we're just going to focus on, hey, chemical buffers. That's how I fix my pH. Got me? All right. First, that's my first way I fix my pH. Secondarily, if that doesn't work initially, like if my pH gets out of balance for whatever reason, physiological buffers is what this is called. Physiological buffers. Okay. They're my next line of defense. Okay. These are my number 2 guy, which include my lungs in the respiratory system and my kidneys in the urinary system, right? Lungs expel CO2, which you're like, okay, why does that matter? Well, CO2 and water combined, that's what that thing was telling us in our lungs, and it can form carbonic acid, which is a form of basically carbonic acid is a combination of the combined form of bicarb and hydrogen ions. But basically, you think CO2 and hydrogen ions have a symbiotic here relationship. So if hydrogen ions are going up, that means CO2 is going up. These are kind of correlated together. Same thing. If CO2 levels go down out of balance, hydrogen ions are going down out of balance. Does that make sense? And again, if this is happening, so say my CO2 is rising, I know my hydrogen ion count's rising, and we learned already with pH, especially for humans, if I have more hydrogen ions than I'm supposed to have, I'm going to be what? More acidic. Okay. Which means my pH is going up or down. It's going to go down that scale. So 7.3 maybe, 3.4, just slightly down off to 7.35. You see that? The second part of this physiological meaning like body, body physiology is doing this. The second is the kidneys, okay? They can expel hydrogen ions out of the body in urine, right? Because the kidneys are all about making urine and get rid of excreting waste. They get rid of hydrogen ions to lower the pH. And again, hydrogen ions decrease, right? Then our acidity is, or we're going to get more alkaline. We're going to go up this pH scale, which is, whatever we want. But that's kidneys take longer to take effect. Lungs, you can start breathing real fast and blow off CO2 within minutes. Chemical buffers, seconds, right? Just always kind of happening. Kidneys take longer, maybe up to 24 hours even, but they are the strongest way of us body correcting a pH balance. Does that make sense? So kidneys, slow and steady, wins the race where they're going for. They can really they can do a 1-2 big punch on the pH balance. They can balance that sucker out, but it takes longer. So maybe we don't have longer. And that's what the images and stuff on page 416 are showing you. I think the good chart to look at on page 416 is that body of work on the bottom right. Okay. So that talks about not everything works at the same time, but it gives you kind of a premise of everything. Again, chemical buffers respond instantaneously, like within seconds. If the pH still remains at a range minutes, respiratory system can change the rate and depth of breathing to adjust CO2 levels, which alters hydrogen, right? Because we just saw, right? Lungs increase my breathing, decrease it, whatever. And then again, renal physiological buffer could be involved, but it takes a long time. Maybe it's slow to respond, taking as long as 24 hours to even be initiated. And that can cause serious damage. Again, so we got chemical buffers, first line defense, kind of always happening. Second line is our physiological buffers, which include our lungs and the respiratory system and our kidneys and in the urinary system. Okay. So he does a good job of kind of trying to explain acidosis versus alkalosis. And I think it's good to hear. Okay. So I would suggest we'll watch this video. If it gets confusing, we'll talk more. We're going to keep talking about this subject. So don't get scared if it gets confusing. But I didn't get to touch on this video here, so I'm going to play this video now.
Hi everyone, a lot of health students have issues with looking at acidosis or alkalosis. This is determining whether the blood is acidic or basic compared to its normal blood pH. Now, there's different types of acidosis and alkalosis. You can have respiratory or you can have metabolic. Now, what I want to talk to you about today is what makes one respiratory-based acidosis alkalosis or metabolic-based acidosis alkalosis. So like I said before, your blood pH needs to sit between the range of 7.35 and 7.45. That's the range that it needs to sit within. If it goes below this particular range, acidosis. If it goes above this particular range, alkalosis. That's the first point. Next point is when we measure pH, the H simply stands for hydrogen ions. That's all we are measuring in this case. But when we do bloods to have a look, when you get medical professionals taking bloods to have a look at whether somebody has acidosis or alkalosis, they don't just look for the pH, they also look for some other factors to tell it whether it's respiratory or metabolic. Let's take a look. All right, first thing is you must know this equation. The equation is that when you breathe, you produce carbon dioxide. This carbon dioxide will inevitably get into your blood, and blood is filled with water. So when carbon dioxide mixes with water, it produces something. The thing it produces is called carbonic acid, which is H2, there's the H2, C from there, O3, because there's 2 there and 1 there. Now, carbonic acid hates itself and splits itself apart, and it produces these two things. It produces bicarbonate ion, and it produces hydrogen ions. Again, when we measure pH, we're just measuring this. So if somebody has acidosis, it means that the quantity or concentration of this is going up, right? If they got alkalosis, the concentration of this is going down. Now, think of this on a seesaw. If you increase carbon dioxide, this goes up, and everything falls in this direction, producing more acid. So the more carbon dioxide, the more acidic. The more acidic, it means it's going down in this direction and the person has acidosis. Usually the body's very good at compensating, and it will bind with that and roll back down in this direction, and you'll breathe that carbon dioxide out. All right, let's talk about acidosis, alkalosis, different types. When we look at respiratory-based acidosis, alkalosis, it's looking at this end of the equation. When we look at metabolic, it's looking at this end of the equation. Now, when somebody has respiratory acidosis, what happens is it's respiratory based, something to do with breathing. Carbon dioxide is the only thing here that we truly breathe. We do breathe out a little bit of water, but mainly carbon dioxide, right? So if somebody has respiratory acidosis, the carbon dioxide levels must be increasing. Respiratory acidosis, increased carbon dioxide, because this means it binds with the water, produces carbonic acid, splits apart and produces hydrogen ions. This is acidic. That's respiratory acidosis. So what happens with the pH? It goes down, dropping down in this direction. All right, that's respiratory acidosis. What about respiratory alkalosis? Well, it's going in the opposite direction. So in respiratory alkalosis, we're not producing enough CO2. So it's not binding with water, it's not creating carbonic acid, and we're not producing enough hydrogen ions, which means we've just got an overabundance of bicarbonate, comparatively, and it becomes more acidotic. So it's a drop in CO2, which results in an increase in the pH. This is respiratory acidosis, respiratory alkalosis. What about metabolic? Metabolic acidosis. Metabolic acidosis is referring to what's happening here. Now think about it. Metabolic acidosis can happen either if you increase the amount of hydrogen ions or if you decrease the amount of bicarbonate, because bicarbonate binds the hydrogen to mop it up and get rid of it. So if that's gone, you're just left with a whole bunch of free hydrogen ions. So when you do the bloods to check for this, in metabolic acidosis, what you'll find is a drop in bicarbonate. This again is if it's uncompensated. and an increase and a drop, in the pH because it's acidosis, so it's going down. In metabolic alkalosis, what's happening is it's producing too many bicarbonate ions, or again, it could be the fact there's not enough hydrogen ions. Maybe one or the other. But what we do know is that in alkalosis, there's more bicarbonate ions if it's uncompensated. And what happens is the pH goes up as well. So this is just a very quick run through of what happens in respiratory-based acidosis alkalosis and metabolic-based acidosis alkalosis.
Okay, so we're back. Maybe. We're back. Okay. So we're going to keep moving on here. So again, this talks about the specific stuff of how our lungs do this. I'm not too concerned about, you're like, okay, tell me how the lungs regulate, pH. And you're like, central chemoreceptors in the brainstem and shit. You don't have to know all that. Just know that, again, the big, kind of like thing is CO2 levels, right? Up or down, hydrogen ions follow. Lungs can blow off or retain CO2 depending on what we need, okay? And again, kidneys reabsorb bicarb, because remember, bicarb and hydrogen kind of have this inverse relationship. We want to increase bicarb, get rid of hydrogen. We can kind of, again, most powerful buffer system, but slowest to respond. Most powerful buffer system, slowest to respond. Repeat it one more time. Kidneys are a kind of second big, kind of like a third line of defense under the umbrella of physiological ways of us maintaining our pH balance. They want to get rid of hydrogen, right? Because if I lose hydrogen, my pH, if I'm acidic, will kind of go reabsorb bicarb to make us more base. Bicarb, B for base. Most powerful buffer system, slowest to respond. All right. Hopefully you guys got that because I repeated a bunch. So this is a video describing the renal control.
When carbon dioxide increases, so does the concentration of hydrogen ions. This causes the body's pH to decline. The renal system works to expel hydrogen ions from the body, while also reabsorbing bicarbonate. This makes the renal system the most powerful of all the buffer systems. Carbon dioxide leaves the blood and enters cells along the distal kidney tubules. In these cells, carbon dioxide combines with water to form carbonic acid, that is, H2CO3. The carbonic acid immediately dissociates to yield hydrogen and bicarbonate ions. The hydrogen ions diffuse out of the cell and into the tubular fluid, where they displace sodium. The displaced sodium diffuses into the tubular cell, where it combines with the bicarbonate to form sodium bicarbonate. Sodium bicarbonate is then reabsorbed into the blood. The end result is that hydrogen ions are excreted into the urine, making the urine acidic, whereas sodium bicarbonate is reabsorbed into the blood. Both actions help increase plasma pH.
Okay. Oops. All right, we're back. We're going to keep on moving on. So when the body's pH rises above normal, pH is rising, which reaction would occur first? We got four options. Respiratory rate would increase. Think about it. What happens if you breathe faster? Think about it. Kidneys would excrete hydrogen ions. Okay. Hydrogen would bind with bicarbonate. Hydrogen would bind with carbonic. Well, that says AC, but that's supposed to be acid. Think about it for a minute. Again, think about what you do know, and you're like, I'm not sure. Gotta go with your best educated guess. All right. Pause it if you need to think for a second. I'm going to go ahead and show the correct answer. So hydrogen would bind with bicarb. So this is that higher level stuff where the book goes back and talks about it. Don't stress about this too much. Again, I like using the book or the PowerPoints questions because they're a lot tougher sometimes and makes us think. This makes us think about it. What this is saying basically is that if we remember back to the previous page on 415, the chemical buffers, it talks about, what's going to occur first is chemical buffers. The chemical buffers help us do things by balancing. So right now, pH is binding, or pH is rising, right? So pH is going up the scale. What does that mean? You remember That means if pH rises, we're getting more basic, right? We're getting more alkaline, okay? So we don't want to be out of balance. So it's all about balance. So it means maybe we don't have enough hydrogen ions, but if hydrogen ions bind with bicarbonate, they form carbonic acid, okay? And then carbonic acid is still acidic, still has hydrogen in it, and it will level out this base a bit, okay? That's what this is saying. So that's, again, higher level stuff. Don't stress about it. Whoops. All right. Another question. Retention of CO2 from hypoventilation would cause what? So again, think about it. CO2, retention of CO2 means I'm retaining CO2, meaning my CO2 level will be higher because I'm breathing slower, right? So this would cause respiratory, again, think about this. We're going to talk through this again, but this is kind of your preamble to think about alkalosis and acidosis, okay? Respiratory alkalosis, alkalosis meaning alkaline base. Respiratory acidosis, again, these are related to, meaning that something related to the lungs is causing this, or metabolic is meaning something related to kidneys or something going on in the body is causing an alkalosis or an alkalotic state or an acidotic state. So retention of CO2, remember CO2 and hydrogen ions, they like each other, right? And they have a pretty synonymous relationship. So my CO2 is rising. What does that mean for my hydrogen ions? Right? They're rising. So my hydrogen ions are rising. If we remember what happens with our hydrogen ions, we can already rule out what? All the alkaloses, right? And since this is talking about CO2 retention, we know CO2 is just talking about the lung, so we can rule out metabolic acidosis. So we have to conclude that this is talking about respiratory acidosis, okay? And again, another book question. We got to think about what's going on here, right? And this kind of gives us the big chart. So if you look at page, this is what we're talking about now, is kind of page 418 and 419. And I think that this chart is kind of the chart that's basically on towards the middle bottom of page 418. Again, we want to balance acts. I think looking at that page itself is just a good reference point to give you an idea of what we're talking about with respiratory and metabolic, okay? Respiratory imbalance is really either going to always result from either excess or deficiency of CO2. So if it's respiratory and you hear something about CO2, it's respiratory all the way, right? Can't be metabolic because our metabolism, such as our kidneys and other stuff, only the lungs can get rid of CO2. And we make a lot of CO2. It's a byproduct of all the aerobic O2 and glucose and all the other good stuff, regulation of metabolism that our cells do. It's a byproduct. We got to get rid of it. Excuse me. So metabolic would be talking about excess of again, either loss of bicarb, excess hydrogen ions. That's what metabolic is focusing on. Okay, so kind of respiratory is easy. Two big things: only CO2, retention of CO2, meaning I've got more CO2 than I need, which means hydrogen ions follow, and this could be related to emphysema, pneumonia, or apnea, like sleep apnea. Right? I'm sleeping, or I'm not breathing while I sleep, and I should be wearing CPAP, that kind of thing, right? I'm going to have more CO2, so that causes an acidotic state because the CO2 and hydrogen ions like each other. Loss of CO2, hyperventilation means like breathing too fast, not having CO2 at all. You're blowing all your CO2 off. This is like a panic attack. That's what I always think of. And I always think of the movies where they give that person a brown paper bag and have them breathe into it. The reason they're doing that is that brown paper bag will act as a way for CO2 to get blown out real fast because you're panicking, and you'll suck it right back in. So you can increase your CO2 level and balance out this alkalosis, okay? Because CO2 and hydrogen have a synonymous relationship. So if I increase my CO2, hydrogen ions follow, everything gets more acidic. Metabolic kind of has more variations. I think the biggest one is probably in either increased production of acids, ketone bodies. This is like diabetes, ketoacidosis, or acidotic state from anaerobic metabolism is talking about, like, you think sepsis, like a bacterial infection causing lactic acid buildup, or diabetes acidosis because my diabetes too high, blood sugar too high, can cause an acidotic state. So ketones. Again, another thing would be like kidneys. If you have kidneys aren't functioning, you're more at risk for not to be able to get to excrete hydrogen ions. Or loss of bicarb is like chronic diarrhea or overuse of laxative is kind of that thing. So diarrhea and other stuff. Bicarb is a big product of things that happen in metabolism in our GI tract. That's kind of we get bicarb from our food. So if we have an issue where we're either malnourished, not eating, or losing a lot of bicarb that are food products through diarrhea, then we can throw that out of balance. And now we've lost all our base and our acid takes over of the balance and we can become more acidic, and it's metabolically related. So probably those are this one makes sense, but I wouldn't. These two are kind of like your big reasons to keep up. The other side, metabolic alkalosis, is much more rare. But like if I overuse antacids, I've got bad GERD, and I just take like 3-4 times the recommended dose of antacids, Tums, for like several days to a week or something like that. Tums is calcium carbonate. It's a form of calcium bicarbonate. Okay. And its job is to reduce acid, right? That's why it makes our stomach GERD or stomach acid hitting our esophagus feel better. So Tums treat by decreasing the acidity of our stomach. And you do that enough, well, we decrease our acid. We have enough, same amount of base. Now we get an alkalotic state. Okay. Lots of vomiting too. Loss of anything that's loss of stomach acid is where you could think of metabolic alkalosis. Okay. And those are complicated, but always start with, is it respiratory? Is it metabolic? Well, it's only respiratory if the question or something's asking me about CO2. If it's not asking me about CO2, then forget about it. And then always go back to trying to, between these differences, you're just trying to think about where do hydrogen ion content. If it's talking about anything that makes something, our body more acidic, then we're going acidosis. If it's anything about we're losing acid, like vomiting, increasing bicarb, that is I'm a balance out of whack, and now I'm going to be alkalosis. Okay. I know it's a lot of information I just hit you with right there. And again, balance and compensation. Chemical buffers gets past that. Respiratory tries to respond. Okay. And these are just telling us that one other system. If we have a respiratory person that has emphysema or COPD and it has a reason why they're getting into an acidotic state based on their high levels of CO2, well, our renal system might try to compensate. But let's get rid of this hydrogen ions. Let's get rid of them. Same thing. If we have a person in kidney failure, they may be breathing faster and having breathing trouble because their body is trying to compensate by blowing off CO2 and getting rid of the hydrogen that way, if that makes sense. Okay. This question says the person with the greatest percentage of body water would be, and this is calling back to the start because again, page 419, don't stress about that. That gives you, again, respiratory compensation, renal compensation. It gives you an idea. It's just more reiteration of the same thing, but that's pretty much chapter 20. So let's look at some questions. Person with the greatest percentage of body water would be, so if you remember this, an obese male, a non-obese male, a non-obese female, a newborn. Think back to that fast fact in the first page. I'll give you a hint. I'll tell you which one's the close second. Okay. The obese male. All right. Let's see what the answer is. Newborn again. Any newborn's like 70-75% water. Their cells are full of water. They're doing a lot of dividing, a lot of stuff. So they're all water pretty much. Secondarily, anyone obese or women, anyone that has more fat distribution is going to be in the fame of having, actually, that was completely incorrect. Holy cow. What a silly guy. A non-obese female would be your close second. Wow. Woo, getting crazy over here. Because again, for newborns, they don't have a lot of fat on them, and they're mostly water. And that's why they also struggle sometimes to maintain body temperature, especially your premature newborns. An obese male would be kind of on the lowest end of the scale of probably out of this scale of body water. The second would be a female because, or the second most water would be the non-obese male, and then the third would be the non-obese female. Maybe something like that because of still has more fat deposits than the male, but probably less than this obese female. I'm talking about morbid or obese male. I'm talking about morbid obesity. When I say obese, okay, don't freak out. I'm talking about morbid obesity. I'm obese, really, if you talk about my weight to height. So patients with bicarbonate deficit, such as chronic diarrhea or overuse of laxatives, would experience what? So again, bicarbonate deficit, losing it, bicarb that mainly we get from our food and our GI tract. I'm losing bicarb. So what is this? First thing you can think of is, this mention CO2 at all? No. What can you check off then? The respiratories. Remember I told you, if you think respiratory, these are your only 4 options for acidotic or alkaline states. They're either metabolic or they're respiratory, and that's it. So we already got rid of, we're not talking about CO2 at all. So we can get rid of our respiratory. So we either have metabolic alkalosis or metabolic acidosis. Remember I told you bicarb, it starts with a B. It's basic. So I'm losing it. I'm out of balance, means I'm going to have more what? Hydrogen ions. So that means that metabolic acidosis would be the state that this person is putting them at risk for. Okay. Next question. An acidic solution would have a pH of 7.50, have increased hydrogen ions, have a pH of 7.42, have decrease in hydrogen ions. Give you a second answer, but I think you guys know this one already. Okay, correct answer, an increased hydrogen ions. Again, acidity always goes with hydrogen ions. Next question. There are 3 mechanisms of the body that the body uses to regulate pH. This mechanism is the slowest, but the most powerful. Our chemical buffer system, the respiratory, the renal system, or none of these answers are correct. All right, you guys should know that this is the renal system. Sorry, my computer just died for a second. Hello? Okay, I'm here. Back. An increase in respiratory rate, for example, during a panic attack. So hyperventilation. What would happen here? 1, there'd be a decrease in carbonic acid in the blood, causes the pH of the blood to decrease, increases carbonic acid in the blood. None of the other listed answers are correct. Which one could you rule out first if you're trying to think through this? Number 2, right? Number 2 causes pH. Okay. Increased respiratory rate means in a panic attack, hyperventilation means we're blowing off CO2. So we're losing acid. Okay. So we're not decreasing pH. We're likely increasing it. So you have to figure out this. And this goes back to that page that talks about carbonic acid. Again, a little bit more difficult. I do not focus on your exam too much about carbonic acid, but I would make to venture that having a general idea of what we're talking about with that carbonic acid is a good idea. So which one do you think it is? 1 of 3. Decrease. Okay. Again, think acids in the name. Carbonic acid is a combination of bicarb and hydrogen ions. Okay. Increased respiratory rate is blowing off CO2. Goodbye hydrogen ions. So I've got a decrease of acid. And that is pretty much it for chapter 20. Okay. So now we're going to move on to chapter 23 is the other half of this unit. And this is reproductive. And again, this will be kind of fast, but it's also going to be much to the point to try and hone in on, specific things. Okay. So for example, let's look at chapter 23. It starts on page 466. 466. So all humans either have a primary sex organs or they have secondary sex organs. Okay. Primary sex organs are the gonads. All right. Sounds like a weird team mascot for a college. Gonads, gonads, gonads. Anyway, all right. Gonads. I'm starting to lose it a little bit here from lack of sleep. Gonads is talking about testicles or testes in men and what in females? Ovaries. Okay. So those are your gonads. All right. They produce sex cells, also called gametes. Sex cells include in males what? Swimmers, sperm. Okay. And eggs or ova. Okay. In females. That's what we're talking about for the still under the category. We're talking about primary sex organs, what they produce. Secondary sex organs and kind of encompass all other organs necessary that are necessary for reproduction. Okay. You need a uterus, the fallopian tubes, all this system for the female is all part of it. Ducts, glands of the penis that help produce semen, the liquid that helps the swimmers get where they're supposed to go. All those are important, but those are secondary sex organs. Primary is talking about just the testes, just the ovaries, okay? So male reproductive system, main job basically is goal as far as, again, we'll talk about the male penis and the urethra and where everything travels, but male reproductive system is designed especially to get sperm where it needs to go to fertilize the egg of a female and create a baby. That's how it was designed. Okay. So first big picture kind of gives us an idea of what we're talking about with the male. Again, testes here, like these egg-shaped, discolored testes here around a bunch of tissue. You don't need to know any of these names. Okay. Testes, men have 2 of them normally. Okay. They're surrounded in this sac that is, again, not known as the ball sac, is known as the scrotum. Okay. So scrotum is the skin, the sac that holds the testicles. For the male, the testes again are the primary sex organ that makes sperm, and men need that. It also helps with testosterone and other things. So testicles are important. But yeah, so testicles, this the skin that holds the testicles in place is the scrotum, and that's the biggest thing. I'm not going to worry about all the other stuff here. Okay, the big point that is on this page, on page 466, is talking about a key reason why the male sexual reproductive system is designed this way, where the testicles, you say, okay, why don't the testicles just be inside and not in the scrotum, hanging outside the body? Wouldn't that be safer for reproductive, for all purposes, right? And probably less painful for men. Okay, yeah, I mean, fair enough, right? Well, it just has to do with the temperature. Sperm specifically needs to develop at a certain temperature that's lower than the body temperature, excuse me. And so that's why they hang it. So about 3 degrees Celsius. 3 degrees Celsius is, I would mark that, highlight that section right there at the top of the body of work section, right at the bottom right corner of page 466. The testicles and the scrotum are in their position because it's about 3 degrees Celsius lower than body temperature. And that's what sperm needs to develop. And that's why they're designed that way. Okay. So this other picture is saying, okay, well, what are we talking about here? So kind of like a side lateral view of the testicle on page 467, or on one of the testes, and talks about a lot about spermatic ducts. Don't have to memorize all these names. There's a lot of names here, and you're like, what's going on? Okay, again, here's our gray, like this is the testicle. Inside its tissue sac, which is the scrotum. Okay, the whole thing is the scrotum. Here's the testicle itself. Not gonna worry about that. The first term that I'm gonna stress for you guys for male reproductive, as far as testicle, right? This is testicle. Sperm is made here, right? Sperm goes through all these different tubules, comes through here, and now it gets in this big wad of little tiny tubules that moves its way around, and that is where it matures. So sperm matures in the epididymis, or epididymis, excuse me, I don't know why I said epididymis. Epididymis is this long section here that kind of comes out, winds all the way through here. This serves as a spot for sperm to mature. Okay, once it leaves the tail of the epididymis, it goes into another big long tube that runs up the spermatic cord out from the testicles, and eventually is going to get to the urethra and bring sperm there, and that is known as the vas deferens. This is the procedure that is for male sterilization. I couldn't think of the word. Male sterilization is a vasectomy, right? You've probably heard that. Vasectomy is literally where a physician will go in on either side of the testicle, because there's 2, where the vas deferens is, sever the vas deferens and cauterize it, and that way sperm can be made and testosterone can be made, all the normal function of sperm, but sperm can never make it out of the vas deferens, because now the pathway is closed off, and eventually the sperm will die and get reabsorbed into the tissue and just kind of go through the process again. But it can never be sperm cells, the sex cells that are made by the testicles, can never make it past the vas deferens once it's severed in a vasectomy. And the other thing to note too is that we'll talk about is that this same tube ends up being the same tube meets with the urethra of the male penis, and that is where ejaculation happens. So it's interesting to note, and it'll come up with the glands, that the same canal, the urethra for men, is both for the urinary system, is also serves as part of the reproductive system to carry semen, which is the fluid form of all of it, sperm and all its other secretions. It can't carry both at the same time, but it will carry one or the other depending on what's going on. Obviously, sexual arousement and all the other things related to sex have a key point in that. All right, moving on. 468, page 468, talks about the accessory glands of the male reproductive system. So you can see, here's our testes we zoomed out from. Here's our vas deferens as it runs all the way up and over the pubic bone and down and around. We have 3 vesicles or 3 glands that are really important for as far as getting stuff getting fluid, or actually, I want to look at the next page, the next slide. But we have 3 glands that are very specific and important to getting sperm cells a protective coating, lubrication coating, and a way to get out of the penis and get into the female reproductive system to do its ultimate job, which is to fertilize the egg. Okay. So looking at this is where we talk about the glands. So same thing, vas deferens runs around here. There's a lot of stuff labeled here. I'm not going to stress about that. I'm really just care about these accessory glands, these 3 glands. Okay. And they're mentioned all on page 468. So this is where I would highlight on 468 is the gland. So seminal vesicle, excuse me. So it surprises about this secretes a thick yellowish fluid into the ejaculatory duct that is comprised about 60% of semen. Okay, 60% of semen. Again, semen, people think of that is actual all ejaculation is. Semen is just the liquid portion, which is made up by these 3 glands. Okay, these 3 glands are what makes semen, liquid portion of that. And then the rest of the portion, like the other 40% of the ejaculation, is all the hundreds of thousands of sperm cells themselves, the sex cells. Okay. So semen is the liquid of all this. So the seminal vesicle, okay, is a fructose solution, fructose being a type of sugar, if you remember. And so this is food for the sperm cells as they make their long journey basically out of the penis into the woman's reproductive and have to get there. They got to have they got to have a snack, and that's the fructose. Okay. They have to have some kind of thing for their cell to use as energy. And that's where fructose comes in. The prostate gland, again, and the seminal vesicle is kind of here off the tail end where the vas deferens meets this, what's known as the ejaculatory duct. Okay. This branch through the prostate gland. Okay. The prostate gland is here, surrounds the urethra and kind of surrounds the ejaculatory duct. Okay. Prostate gland produces kind of another 30% of the fluid portion of semen. But it produces a liquid that helps with motility. So it basically, like, think of it as like mucus almost. It's the prostate gland secretes something necessary for the sperm to have some kind of way to slide where they need to go, and a vehicle, so to speak, kind of like mucus as a vehicle for things to move through the body. Similar, the bulbourethral glands here. Okay, I'll try to erase this. The bulbourethral gland is kind of the last. It's also called the Cowper's gland, I think, named on the person that discovered it. But so this is kind of like during sexual arousal, the bulbourethral gland will lubricate the urethra. So this gland is like lubrication. What does that mean? Well, it lubricates and it also decreases the acidity of the urethra, because the urethra also has urine, which is very acidic and full of waste products. So this gland would be pre-ejaculatory liquid that's secreted through here to kind of clear the way down the urethra, to clear it out of like the acidity and anything left over from urine, clear it out as in preparation for the liquid portion, semen and its sperm cells, to be ejaculated out. Okay. So those 3 glands are pretty important. And if there's anything wrong with them, there could be things, especially prostate. So prostate disorders are talked about at the bottom of page 468. I think the biggest thing is just kind of the name for what they call benign prostatic hyperplasia, is saying I have a benign, meaning it's not cancerous, prostate enlargement. And the prostate, if you imagine, this gland surrounds, right, the urethral duct, or excuse me, the ejaculatory duct and the urethra out of the bladder for a male, right? So that problem, if this swells anyway, it's going to close off, make urine flow hard, maybe problems with ejaculation. So urine stream can be that. So I would just say, have a general idea of that concept of prostate disorder, saying, again, especially the BPH, the benign prostate hyperplasia, very common condition in men, especially older men. Okay. That's the biggest thing, is those glands that I would highlight from that, and kind of the general male anatomy and how we get, from testes and sex cells, sperm made here, till we get to outside the body. This section, again, on page 469, talks about male anatomy. Penis talks about penis with and without foreskin and circumcision. There's a little bit about all that stuff. Again, I'm not too concerned about that. general concept of it's good, but I'm not going to test you over that. Same thing with like sperm. Sperm, we should have a general idea of what it looks like, right? It's got a head where kind of the motil where its kind of nucleus lives and energy gets produced here, and a flagella, big tail that just whirls around and spins it where it needs to go. Okay. You don't need to know this process at all. Again, what this is saying is just like our egg. Again, if you remember, my meiosis is whenever sex cells combine and then split into, make a baby. So we need sex cells. This is meiosis, when cells split to form sex cells in the testicles, or even in the ovaries for the oocytes or the ovums, ovas, the eggs. They produce a cell. Sex cells only contain 23 chromosomes. That's what this is, 23 chromosomes, because it's going to combine with another 23 chromosomes of the opposite gender and make a baby that way. So that's just kind of a reminder of that. You don't need to know this process, okay? So semen, again, semen is just talking about the whole package, like the liquid with the several 100,000 sperm cells in it. That's semen, and it consists of seminal vesicles, which again, if you remember, those seminal vesicles are like the fructose, the energy source for the sperm. 30% is prostate gland, which is kind of like our liquid vehicle, mucousy, slimy liquid that the sperm get sent through. And then 5% is those bulbourethral gland, which is that small amount basically secreted pre-ejaculatory phase, just to get rid of, right? Like, get rid of the acidity and any debris, anything left from urine to the urethra for men. Okay. And also, I think it's interesting to note, each ejaculation for a man, as far as you talk about, okay, well, there's semen and liquid and contains how many sperm does it contain? It can contain millions, actually. I was saying 100,000, more like millions. So the book kind of gives us a fast fact that 2 to 5 milliliters of semen can contain anywhere from 40 to 100 million sperm individually. So that's a crazy amount. So this is a good video for the male reproductive. He does pretty much like a lot of it, right? And it's helpful to hear a lot of the other stuff. Again, I focus on the glands and just the general testes and general anatomy, but it wouldn't be bad to give this video a look either. So I'm gonna make this big and we'll play this video now.
The male reproductive system. Now, most people are familiar with the external structures of the male reproductive system, but there's actually a lot of structures inside that people are less familiar with. In this video, we're going to look at all of those different structures of the male reproductive system, what each of them does, and how they're all connected to each other and to other structures in the urinary system. And then we'll identify all of those structures on the torso model to get a better idea of their three-dimensional orientation inside of the pelvic cavity. So let's jump to the whiteboard and get started. So here we have a sagittal cross-section of the pelvic area. We can see a leg back here, we can see the penis, the scrotum, and we can also see the colon and the anus, where the colon connects to the outside of the body. Posterior to the colon, we have vertebrae of the spinal cord, and here on the anterior side, we have the front of the pelvis, or really the cartilage between the two halves of the pelvis, as you can see on Mortimer here. The main reason that I include these structures in the diagram is to give us a better understanding of where the male reproductive structures are in relation to nearby organs. The first structure we'll talk about are the testes. The testes are the primary sex organ in the male reproductive system, and they're the site of spermatogenesis, or the creation of sperm cells. Before they technically become sperm cells, these cells, called spermatocytes, will undergo meiosis, which is going to reduce their number of chromosomes from the normal 46 down to 23. Most of the cells in the human body have 46 chromosomes, or 23 pairs of chromosomes. But after undergoing the process of meiosis, that number is reduced down to 23 individual chromosomes. Whenever fertilization of an egg cell occurs, 23 chromosomes will come from the sperm cell and 23 chromosomes from the egg cell, creating a new combination of 46 chromosomes for that new zygote. Inside the testes are these long coiled tubes called the seminiferous tubules. As these spermatocytes travel through the seminiferous tubules, they'll undergo these processes of mitosis and meiosis, and they'll eventually develop into mature sperm cells that have the potential to fertilize an egg. Now, before we move on, let's take a look at the structure of the sperm cell itself. The sperm cell will have a head, which will contain the nucleus, and that's where all the genetic material, those 23 chromosomes, are going to be located. In the body of the sperm cell, there's going to be a mitochondria that's shaped in this strange sort of coil pattern, and that's going to help provide the sperm cell with the energy that it needs. And finally, there's the tail. The tail is in a coil, and it's going to rotate and spin. That coiled rotation of the tail will help that cell travel through the female reproductive tract for fertilization if sexual intercourse has occurred. A couple fun facts about the sperm cells. They can only make left turns because of the direction that their tail rotates. Another interesting fact is that sperm cells are the smallest human cells in the body, and egg cells are actually the largest human cell in the body. And whereas the egg cells have a lot of nutrients already built into the cell itself, the sperm cells have to get all of their energy from sugar that's found in the fluid that surrounds the sperm cells. Now, this process of spermatogenesis, or the production of sperm cells, takes place at a slightly lower temperature than the body's normal internal temperature. And because of that, the testes must hang outside of the body in a sac called the scrotum. The scrotum is essentially a patch of skin that's going to help regulate the temperature of the testes to maximize sperm cell production. Whenever it's cold, the scrotum will contract and pull those testes up closer to the body to keep them warm. And whenever it's warm, then the scrotum will relax so those testes can keep farther from the warmer temperatures of the internal body. The testes also produce testosterone, the primary male sex hormone. They're not drawn in the diagram, but there's lots of blood cells that go to the testes. And whenever the testes produce testosterone, it's not going to go through the other tubes that I'm about to talk about. That hormone will travel directly into the bloodstream straight from the testes. The sperm cells, however, follow a different path. They're going to travel next through a structure called the epididymis. The epididymis starts at the top or superior part of the testes, and then it's going to travel down and then back up to the vas deferens. The epididymis is basically an extension of those seminiferous tubules where the sperm cells will continue to grow and mature and develop until they're ready for ejaculation. Now, during sexual arousal and then ejaculation, the sperm cells will travel up through a tube called the vas deferens. The vas deferens extends from the testes and the epididymis upward, anterior to that pelvic bone, and then posterior to the back. Connected to the back or the posterior part of the vas deferens are a pair of glands called the seminal vesicles. That word seminal is the same root as semen, and the seminal vesicles are going to produce some of the fluid that the sperm travel through during ejaculation. And to clarify a couple terms here, sperm refers to the cells produced by the testes that carry genetic information, whereas semen refers to both the fluid and the cells that travel during ejaculation. The semen acts as lubrication for the sperm cells to travel, as well as providing nutrients that supply the sperm with the energy that they need. And just past the seminal vesicle, the two vas deferens will join with the urethra, which is connected to the bladder. So here's the bladder, which of course stores urine until it's ready to be expelled during urination. And the bladder is connected to the kidneys by two tubes called ureters, which will bring the fluid from the kidneys down to the bladder to be stored. You can see that here in the diagram as well. This spot where the two vas deferens join together with the urethra is also surrounded by a gland called the prostate gland. The prostate, just like the seminal vesicle, will secrete some of the fluid that makes up the semen that the sperm travel through. Now, the prostate gland in the male reproductive system is a common site of a couple disorders, an enlarged prostate or even prostate cancer. And after a certain age, men need to have their prostates checked. So let's talk real quick about prostate exams. Notice on the diagram the location of the prostate. It's really close to the colon, but it's pretty far from everywhere else. And so how does a physician check a prostate to see if it's enlarged or if there's a chance of prostate cancer? Well, they can test through a digital examination, or in other words, inserting the finger up through the anus into the colon and feeling for the anterior side of the prostate. And that way they can tell if the prostate gland is larger than it should be, which is indicative of prostate cancer or an enlarged prostate. Oftentimes, one of the first symptoms of an enlarged prostate or prostate cancer is difficulty urinating. So let's think about why that would be. Well, notice that the prostate surrounds the urethra just below the bladder. If that prostate is enlarged, it's going to be pushing on the walls of the urethra, making it really difficult for urine to travel through the urethra and out of the body. Just inferior to the prostate is a pair of glands called the Cowper's glands or the bulbourethral glands. Bulbo because they're shaped like a bulb, and urethral because they're attached to the urethra. Just like the prostate and the seminal vesicle, the bulbourethral glands will secrete part of the fluid that makes up the semen. From there, the urethra extends through the shaft of the penis and then out to the outside of the body. The penis, of course, is the main delivery system of the sperm. Basically, the sperm travel through the penis and outside of the body during ejaculation. The end or the head of the penis is referred to the glans penis. And here surrounding the glans penis is the foreskin, which sometimes gets removed during circumcision. If we want to follow the path of sperm traveling from the testes to the outside of the body, it would go like this. The sperm are made in the testes. They'll develop as they travel through those seminiferous tubules, through the epididymis, and then they'll travel up through the vas deferens, then back, and then down. There they'll mix with semen, which is produced by the seminal vesicle, prostate, and bulbourethral glands. And then from the vas deferens, they'll connect to the urethra, where the sperm will travel out through the penis. To follow the path of urine out of the body, urine will of course start in the kidney, travel down through the ureters into the bladder, where it's stored. Then during urination, the bladder will contract and that'll expel the urine down through the urethra to the outside of the body. And just as a reminder, testosterone doesn't travel through any of this. Testosterone goes straight from the testes into the bloodstream where it travels throughout the body. Speaking of which, while I've got this diagram up, let's talk about vasectomies. During a vasectomy, the doctor will make a little incision in through the scrotum, and they'll make a cut into the vas deferens, hence vasectomy, or cutting of the vas deferens. When the two ends of the vas deferens are cut and tied off, then suddenly sperm are not able to exit the body through that vas deferens. Any sperm that are produced will just break down and be absorbed. Now, somebody deciding to have a vasectomy might have some concerns about this. They could wonder, will ejaculation still happen? And the answer is yes. If you notice, the path of semen traveling from the prostate gland and the seminal vesicle and the bulbourethral gland is not obstructed by the vasectomy. They could also wonder about testosterone. Would a vasectomy reduce their body's ability to make and release testosterone? The answer to that is no as well. Because remember, the testosterone doesn't travel through the vas deferens at all. It just goes straight to the bloodstream from the testes. Now let's take a look at Terry the torso model's reproductive system and see what these structures look like three-dimensionally in the body. So let's start with the external structures that we can see. Here we have the glans penis as well as the shaft of the penis. We have the scrotum, which is going to surround the testes, and we have the epididymis just above the testes right here. You'll notice here in the scrotum we have these red lines, which are muscles, which will pull the testes up closer to the body or let them go farther away from the body depending on the temperature. So sperm cells will grow in the testes, they'll mature in the epididymis, and they're going to travel up the vas deferens, which runs up here. You can see the vas deferens better on this side as it travels this way, and then on this side the vas deferens travels back this way. And the two vas deferens are going to run in front of the pelvic bone, which we can see right there. So as the sperm travel up through the vas deferens, they're going to reach back here, the seminal vesicles, where the seminal fluid or semen gets released. And then the vas deferens will converge back here. I can open up the model here and we can see a little bit better. Here's the prostate gland, and there's the little tube. That's the vas deferens where it's connecting to the urethra. We have the bladder here. And here on the side, we can see that's going to be one of the ureters that connects up to the kidney. Back over here, we can follow the urethra as it travels down through the prostate gland. Here's going to be the bulbourethral gland, that tiny little gland right there. And then the urethra travels down through here and then out through the shaft of the penis. Back here, of course, you see the colon, which is really close to the prostate gland. And then there is the anus. I can also show a cross section of the inside of the penis, which looks like this. It's going to have the urethra, which travels through right there, and that's where urine and semen both travel through. These other two sections right here and right here are blood sinuses. During an erection, the arteries in those areas will expand and blood will rush into the penis during the erection. So to recap all of those structures again, we have the scrotum, the testes, the epididymis. That's going to connect to the vas deferens, which runs along here. We have the seminal vesicle. The vas deferens will connect right here to the urethra. That's in the prostate gland. Here's the bladder. We've got the ureter back over on this side. The urethra extends down through here. There's the Cowper's or bulbourethral gland. And then the urethra extends the rest of the way down through the penis. All right, that was a lot of different structures. Take a moment, pause the video, and see if you can identify all of the structures of the male reproductive system, as well as what each structure does. First, we have the testes, which are the primary sex organ of the male reproductive system. They'll produce testosterone, as well as produce and develop sperm. The sperm cells travel through the epididymis, where they mature and develop. And both the testes and the epididymis are contained within the scrotum, which is going to help regulate the temperature of the testes. During ejaculation, sperm will travel through the vas deferens, and those sperm will pass by the seminal vesicle, the prostate gland, and the bulbourethral or Cowper's gland, which all produce some of the fluid that makes up the semen. And here on the diagram, we have the bladder, which is connected to the kidneys via the ureters. And the urethra extends down from the bladder. It'll connect to the vas deferens in the prostate gland, and then run to the outside of the body through the penis. The head of the penis is referred to as the glans penis, and it's surrounded by the foreskin. So those were the structures of the male reproductive system. Thanks for watching. Normally this is the part of the video where I make jokes to fill the time while asking you to subscribe or watch another video, but it feels weird to make jokes about the reproductive system. So I guess I'll just put this back and see you next time. Whee!
Okay, And we're back. So I'm gonna keep moving. So kind of after that, we move into that from the male anatomy to the female reproductive side. Okay. And again, this is going to be more of an overview of the anatomy, general stuff. Not going to focus too heavy on it. Biggest thing I think focus is kind of talking about the ovarian and menstrual cycle, like the woman's cycle and what that looks like. Okay. So this is a side sagittal view or mid sagittal view. Kind of gives all that. Again, for women, you can see again the urethra to the bladder, close proximity to the vagina and the anus, and that's what makes UTI so prone. But vagina goes to the cervix of the uterus, which is the cervical canal. Okay. Cervix is the name for this kind of entry point canal to the uterus, and this is where the sperm has to go. And the cervix also is what they're checking when see if someone's dilated. Okay, if cervix is opening, dilated in the face, that's ready for a baby on the other side of the uterus here. That's what they're checking when women check for that. And then 2 fallopian tubes that attach to either side of the uterus. So we can look at that in a second. All I really want you don't have to know this process of like the follicles. So you hear follicle is talking about sex cells. Just I think the only thing I'm going to highlight here is circling is oocyte or oocyte. I say oocyte because it's 2 O's. That's the egg. The oocyte itself is like ovulated oocyte is that it's released. The oocyte is released. What it is, the oocyte is an immature 23 chromosome egg. Like the egg is all the way through here. Now it's 23 chromosomes. The oocyte gets released and it's waiting for sperm. If it doesn't get sperm, and that's when the menstruation and menstrual cycle process starts. If it doesn't get fertilized with the sperm cell and eventually grow into a baby, then the uterus gets mad, and that's the process that happens. But this is fallopian tube, or excuse me, ovary releasing towards the fallopian tube, the oocyte. Which again, oocyte is only that I'm going to highlight as an immature, ready to be fertilized egg, which is the primary sex cell of females. Okay. So a bunch of stuff here. There's 3 different linings of the uterus, which, is always kind of important. But the innermost endometrium, I'll highlight here because endometrium is what is shed for women during menstruation. And we'll talk through that. Other than that, the general anatomy is like kind of a cross tree kind of narrow. So vagina to cervix. Again, cervix is what you'll be checking if it's dilated or not when someone's pregnant, getting ready to have birth, right? Baby's coming from the uterus into the vagina. And this is also where the path of sperm has to get through the cervix. That's why sperm needs the energy, needs the different secretions. It's got to get its all the way up the uterine wall and take a detour and go 1 or 2 places, either to this ovary or that fallopian tube, which is this. These are fallopian tubes, is how they're named, and get to here where it's going to kind of go through a liquid and basically just kind of in midair liquid kind of catch the oocyte as it's released from the ovary here. These are the ovaries, right? Oocyte's release, sperm is here. I can't really draw a sperm at this detail. Catches the egg. Egg's actually way bigger than sperm, but catches the egg here, fertilize, and then the egg and the sperm will fertilize and grow as they run down the fallopian tube and implant in the uterine wall, the wall of the uterus, and that's the endometrium. And that's why the endometrium changes. It becomes very vascular, kind of gets thicker, as in ready to receive the fertilized egg. If it doesn't receive the fertilized egg, then the menstrual cycle happens where this endometrium necrosis, it dies, it loses off blood vessels, sloughs off this inside the uterine wall, and then starts to regrow again. And that sloughing off is the bleeding that is for women menstruation. Okay, so then this talks about the layers. Endometrium again sloughs off during menstruation, innermost lining of the uterus, and this is some other naming that we're not going to be too concerned about. Okay, but I think just again that middle layer. Okay, and the cervix canal, cervix into the uterus. Kind of the idea of you can kind of think about a path of sperm trying to get to an egg. Okay. External genitalia, I'm not going to worry about that. For most women, there's a labia majora, labia minora, clitoris. Clitoris has several neurons that are firing. There's a lot of nerve impulses. So I'm not going to stress about female genitalia or external genitalia, just like I'm not going to stress about male external genitalia. We're going to move on to talking about And again, same thing with kind of the breast. I'm not going to worry about that too much for our purposes. We'll get more of that. You'll get a lot more of that with OB. This is just kind of a sagittal view of the breast tissue. So female reproduction, we're talking about ovarian cycle, female. So reproductive cycle is kind of what menstruation is all about, what happens with menstruation. That's just one part of it. This kind of starts discussed on 476 to 477 all the way through 479. And there's a lot of information here. So we'll try to kind of tone this down right to the big stuff. Okay. So the reproductive cycle itself is about 28 days length. So that month. Okay. And it can range kind of anywhere. It depends on what's going on. But both of the cycles, as far as ovarian and menstrual, are kind of under control of hormones, mainly the follicle stimulating hormone, FSH, and LH, luteinizing hormone. Remember that. Okay. And menstruation has a lot to do with our two big female hormones, estrogen and progesterone. Okay. So I think just these phases is good. So if I look at, I'm not too much concerned with you guys knowing. I think for now, the easiest thing or the most interesting thing for us to kind of get is the menstrual cycle. That's on page 478. Okay. Oh.
The ovarian cycle begins on the first day of menstruation, as the ovaries prepare to release an egg. Low levels of estrogen and progesterone stimulate the hypothalamus to release gonadotropin-releasing hormone, or GnRH. GnRH stimulates the anterior pituitary to release follicle-stimulating hormone, or FSH, and luteinizing hormone, or LH. FSH triggers several follicles in the ovary to resume development. This begins what is known as the follicular phase. Only one follicle will make it to maturity. As the follicle develops, it secretes estrogen, which stimulates the thickening of the endometrium in the menstrual cycle, as well as small amounts of progesterone. As the follicle matures, it migrates to the surface of the ovary. The mature follicle is called a Graafian follicle. In the midpoint of the cycle, estrogen levels peak, triggering a spike in LH. The sudden spike in LH causes the follicle to rupture and release the ovum, a process called ovulation. The fimbriae of the fallopian tube sweep across the top of the ovary to catch the emerging oocyte. The remnants of the follicle remain on the ovary and form the corpus luteum. This marks the beginning of the luteal phase. The corpus luteum secretes large amounts of progesterone and small amounts of estrogen. The progesterone causes the endometrium to continue to thicken and become more vascular, preparing it for pregnancy. High levels of progesterone and estrogen also inhibit the pituitary from producing FSH and LH so that no other follicles develop. If fertilization does not occur, the corpus luteum degenerates into inactive scar tissue called the corpus albicans. Estrogen and progesterone levels plummet. This causes the endometrium to slough off, resulting in menstruation. As the ovarian hormones decline, the pituitary is no longer inhibited. FSH levels begin to increase, and a new cycle begins.
Okay, so the menstrual cycle. So again, this is kind of on page 478, and then you can kind of, I would compare 478 as much as with the ovarian and uterine cycles that pictures on page 479, but it makes sense. So if you're looking at your book, okay, we can look at the menstrual phase. That's talking about the first day of bleeding. That's the first noticeable day of vaginal bleeding, lasting 3 to 5 days. Menstruation, again, occurs when that endometrial lining sheds off. So let's start. I want to kind of skip that. I would put that number as 1. Let's talk about like right after a woman's period or menstrual cycle. We talked about the proliferative phase that's talked about there. Okay. And this is kind of like that next week to 2 weeks. So for a woman, estrogen grows. That causes growth of blood vessels and the lining of the endometrium. And then around that same time, ovulation happens, which ovulation again is ovulation. Okay. Ovulation is the ovary with an O releasing an oocyte, okay, immature egg, or an egg that needs immature egg is probably not the right term. An oocyte would be an egg an egg released by a woman that needs to be fertilized, or released egg, oocyte, and then hopes for sperm to. So in that same sense, kind of while this is happening, progesterone endometrial thickening is increasing. So that means the lining's thickening it up. And you can see this too. If you look at page 479, it discusses right there, right? Ovulation, here's our oocyte being released, right? And there's peak of LH and hormones, and our lining of the uterus is growing with blood. The pre-menstrual phase is, again, progesterone drops. Yeah, and this is transition is happening. Okay, oocyte's been released, doesn't get fertilized, and it sits for a little bit, and it's like, well, I'm mad about not being fertilized, so my endometrium progesterone levels drop, and that makes the endometrium become ischemic. Ischemic, remember, is lacking oxygen, so the endometrium dies off and then sloughs off during the next phase. So let me clear this. Why did that skip? I guess I skipped a slide. Anyway, oh yeah. So that the endometrium sloughs off during the next phase. Okay, and you can see here the like secretory phase kind of area here, and then you can see the secretory phase, right, is where like everything's ready for the baby. The oocyte's been released during ovulation, and the uterine wall is expecting a fertilized egg, aka a baby, to be implanted in the wall. It doesn't happen during that time period. Then the premenstrual phase starts, and that's where the endometrium gets ischemic, and it kind of comes back to the menstrual phase. Now, as it gets ischemic, endometrium dies, sloughs off. That causes the bleeding, and that bleeding lasts for the 2 to 5 days or however long it lasts. And that's the menstrual cycle, which is related to this ovulation, this oocyte being released. I hope that makes some sense to you. As far as the specific stuff for like corpus luteum and like the actual ovary and its releasing, I'm not too concerned about that. I think focus on the menstrual cycle and kind of what the endometrium is doing is where I'll stay for this right now. And you'll get more of everything else as you get into OB and other stuff. So we got Secret Sciences. He's got the female reproductive system. Again, he's going to list more stuff than we have covered here. Focus on what we've covered, but it's not a bad idea to try and put it all together, and he's going to give you that all together view, right? Okay. So we'll watch. I'll make the video big, and we'll watch this.
The female reproductive system. Every person watching this video was developed in a female reproductive system before you were born. It's sort of our first home if you think about it. In this video, we're going to take a look at the internal structures of the female reproductive system. Then we're going to take a look at the external genitalia, and then we'll come back to the torso model to take a look three-dimensionally at how these structures are arranged. So let's jump to the whiteboard and get started. Here in the sagittal cross-section, we can see a leg. On the anterior side, we see part of the pelvic bone, or really the cartilage between the two halves of the pelvis. On the posterior side, we have the colon, as well as the anus, where the colon connects to the outside of the body. And then we have the spine drawn posterior to that. Those are just some of the nearby structures on the sagittal view to help us see where these reproductive organs are. Here on the anterior side of the sagittal cross-section, just inferior to the pelvic bone, is the clitoris. The clitoris is composed of erectile tissue, which will fill with blood during sexual stimulation and arousal. It's actually a homologous structure to the male penis. I'm going to refer to several homologous structures throughout this video. Any homologous structure means that a fetus, when it's developing before sexual differentiation, in other words, before the sexual organs of the fetus develop into the male form or the female form, they start as the same structure. So there's an undifferentiated organ in the fetus that'll either become the glands of the penis or it becomes the clitoris, depending on the presence of more testosterone or more estrogen during development of the fetus. Just posterior to the clitoris, we have the urethra. The urethra in the female reproductive system is very short. It's going to run from the outside of the body just up to the bladder. The bladder here, of course, is connected to the kidneys via 2 ureters. So, of course, whenever the kidneys filter out water and waste from the blood, which we call urine, that urine will travel down the ureters into the bladder, and then during urination, that urine will travel from the bladder through the urethra to the outside of the body. If you remember, in the male reproductive system, the urethra is connected to the male reproductive system via the vas deferens. But in the female reproductive system, the urinary tract is kept separate from the reproductive parts. Now, anterior to the urethra is the vagina. The vagina extends from the outside of the body superiorly to the uterus. The vagina is primarily composed of elastic tissue which can extend. Now, surrounding the vagina are 2 glands called the Bartholin's glands or the greater vestibular glands. The primary function of the Bartholin's or greater vestibular gland is to produce mucus to lubricate the vagina. Now on the most superior part of the vagina, right where it connects to the uterus, there's this U-shaped part right here, and that's called the fornix. The most posterior and inferior part of the uterus where it connects to the vagina is called the cervix. And cervical cancer is cancer of the cervix, or this part of the uterus that connects to the vagina right here. Now here we have the uterus. The uterus is going to be the site of development of an embryo and then a fetus during a pregnancy. Now there's different parts of the uterus. We have the fundus, we have the body of the uterus, and then the cervix of the uterus. And this internal part, or the inside lining of the uterus, is called the endometrium. During menstruation, that endometrium, or that internal lining of the uterus, is what comes out through the vaginal canal during menstruation or during the period. Extending out from the uterus on either side are the fallopian tubes, and here at the end of the fallopian tubes are the ovaries. The ovaries are the site of oogenesis, yep, 2 O's there, which is the process of development of an egg cell to get ready for fertilization. These sort of pre-egg cells that we call oocytes undergo the process of meiosis, where they're reduced from the 46 chromosomes down to 23 chromosomes. Then during fertilization, 23 chromosomes will come from the egg, 23 from the sperm, to create a new set of 46 chromosomes, or 23 pairs of chromosomes for that zygote. That process of releasing an egg from the ovary is called ovulation. When ovulation occurs, an egg cell will get released from the ovary and it'll travel through the fallopian tube. If sexual intercourse happens and sperm cells enter into the uterus, those sperm cells will fertilize the egg while the egg is in the fallopian tube. If the egg cell gets fertilized and becomes a zygote, then that zygote will split into 2 cells, and then into 4 cells, and into 8 cells, and so on. Eventually, whenever that ball of cells reaches the uterus, it'll implant into the endometrium, where it's going to get nutrients from the mother's bloodstream, and it'll continue growing and becoming an embryo and then a fetus. If fertilization does not occur, then that egg cell will break down while it's in the fallopian tube, and then it will just come out during menstruation with the rest of the endometrium. Besides oogenesis and ovulation, the ovary is going to produce 2 hormones, estrogen and progesterone. So while I've got this diagram up, let's talk about tubal ligations. A tubal ligation is a type of female contraception that's very similar to a vasectomy, where the vas deferens is cut. In a tubal ligation, the fallopian tubes are cut and they're tied off, and that way sperm cells and egg cells cannot meet in the middle for fertilization. Of course, this has no effect on estrogen and progesterone production by the ovaries. The ovaries are surrounded by lots of blood vessels, and those hormones enter directly into the bloodstream from the ovaries via those blood vessels. Ovulation still occurs, menstruation still occurs. The main difference is that fertilization can't occur. Another common procedure is called a hysterectomy. A hysterectomy is a full removal of the uterus itself. This, of course, acts as a permanent contraception. There's going to be no fertilization of an egg cell. It would also cause menstruation to not to happen because the uterus itself is gone. A lot of times that's performed if somebody's at a higher risk of cervical cancer, because cervical cancer is cancer of the cervix. So if you remove that whole organ, then cervical cancer can't occur. Okay, now let's zoom out to the outside of the body and take a look at the external structures of the female reproductive system. Here we have the left leg, and here we have the right leg. Here's the anterior side, or the front, and then here's the posterior side, or the back of this region. This whole region here is called the vulva. All of these structures that I'm about to show collectively are called that, the vulva. Starting with the outside here, we have the labia majora, and inside of that we have the labia minora. The labia majora are larger skin folds that are often covered with hair, and inside of that are smaller skin folds called the labia minora, which are usually smooth and hairless. Here at the top of the diagram, or the most anterior part of this, is the clitoris. And the clitoris is covered by the clitoral fold. The clitoral fold is a homologous structure with the foreskin of the penis in the male reproductive system. Posterior to this, or below this on the diagram, is the urethral opening. And just posterior or below that in this diagram is the vaginal opening. On either side of the vaginal opening are going to be those Bertholin's glands, or the greater vestibular glands. And finally, posterior to all of that is the anus. So again, this whole area is called the vulva. We have the labia majora, the labia minora. We have the clitoris, the urethra, the vaginal opening, and the anus. All right, now let's jump back to the torso model and take a look at the 3-dimensional structure of all of these. All right, so I've got the female reproductive system model here. Let's take a look. Let's start with the external structures. Here we're going to have the labia majora, and then just inside that we're going to have the labia minora. You can see it a little bit better if I open this up here. So labia majora, and then the labia minora just inside that. And this whole area is called the vulva. If we look from the superior part, we can see several structures. We have the uterus right here. We have the ovary and the fallopian tube on that side, and the ovary and the fallopian tube on this other side. And on the model, we can open up part of the uterus here to take a look inside there. Of course, this inner lining of the uterus is called the endometrium. And here's where that uterus connects to the fallopian tube on either side. If we could see down farther, we'd see where the cervix is. So uterus, the ovary, and fallopian tube. So let's take the model and let's open it up and look at the sagittal cross section right here. Starting with the anterior side, we have the clitoris, which is the erectile tissue. We have the urethra, which connects to the bladder. Here we have the vaginal opening and the vagina. The Bartholin's or greater vestibular glands, we can't see these on this diagram here because they would be either here closer to the camera or on the other side of the vagina. Here is the fornix, where it sort of makes that U shape. And then we have the uterus. This bottom part of the uterus is called the cervix, the body of the uterus, and the fundus. If I remove this, we can see it a little bit better. Then we have the fallopian tube, which comes around and wraps to the ovary. If you look here, you'll see another piece of tissue that connects from the ovary to the uterus. That's actually the ovarian ligament, and that's just going to help hold the ovary in place. We also have something called the broad ligament, which is going to hold all of these structures in place as well. And then here in the back, we have the colon and the anus. All right, let's do a quick recap. Take a look at this sagittal and frontal cross section. Pause the video and see if you can identify all of the structures as well as what they do. Starting with the anterior side, we have the clitoris, which is erectile tissue. We have the urethra, which connects up to the bladder. We have the vagina or the vaginal canal, the Bartholin's glands or the greater vestibular glands. Here's the cervix, which is the part of the uterus that's closest to the vagina. Here we have the uterus, which includes the fundus, the body, and the cervix. We have the inner lining of the uterus called the endometrium. That's going to be the part that develops during the menstrual cycle and then is menstruated or shed during menstruation. We have the fallopian tubes, which connect the uterus to the ovaries. The ovaries are the site of oogenesis and ovulation, where an egg gets released, where it has the chance to be fertilized by a sperm cell. Finally, in the posterior part of the diagram, we have the colon as well as the anus. Now, pause the video again and see if you can identify the external structures of the female reproductive system. Here we have the labia majora and the labia minora. Here is the clitoris. Below this on the diagram is the urethral opening. Here's the vaginal opening, and finally the anus. All right, great. You've made it to the end of the video. Hopefully you learned something about the female reproductive system. Now we just have another end credits for reproductive system video. So, don't know what else to talk about. I guess subscribe to see more videos. Okay, bye.
Okay, we're back. So we'll get out of this video and kind of finish this up. So we'll finish up with some questions like we do. The mucous membrane lining of the uterus is the mucous membrane lining the uterus is the what? Myometrium, fundus, endometrium, or cervix. And you guys can pause it if you want to know, but endometrium, again, I highlight the endometrium because that's the inside layer. That's where the baby's implanted. That's what sloughs off and is what is the debris of that. The cells and the blood and blood vessels and the tissue itself is what is menstruation and bleeding, the period. Also, I'll make a note that the methods of birth control, I'm not going to stress about that. You'll get that in the program. You'll get that in OB. That's on page 481. I mean, biggest thing is, that just you can breeze over that, but I'm not going to test over that necessarily. Okay. What happens during the premenstrual phase if fertilization does not take place? Progesterone levels rise and endometrium continues to grow and thickens. Progesterone levels plummet and the endometrium continues to grow in anticipation of pregnancy. Progesterone levels plummet and the endometrium becomes necrotic and sloughs off, beginning menstrual flow. Progesterone levels rise and the endometrium becomes necrotic, sloughs off, become menstrual flow. So I'll give you, pause it so you can think about it because I'm not going to pause it for you. So just pause. Give a second to think about it. Again, in the premenstrual phase. Okay. So this is kind of like premenstrual phase into menstrual phase right here, right? Menstrual phase is starting. Menstrual phase is starting, okay? That's the correct answer. All right. The tube that carries sperm out of the body and is also part of the urinary system is what? It's back to male reproductive. Give you a second to answer. Urethra. Again, urethra shares for the urinary system and for the male reproductive system. Increase in release of estrogen plus growth of blood vessels and endometrium prepares them for which phase of the female reproductive cycle? Ovulation, menstrual, menarche, or premenstrual. And again, female reproductive, you can kind of, to me, the female reproductive cycle focuses on more on the ovary or the ovarian cycle. Female reproductive cycle is talking about menstruation and all of it to me, like including the release of the, there is a way that hormones and stuff is how the ovaries go from, just egg sitting there to being released as a new oocyte, but I'm not concerned about that for us. So for us, where are we going here? Correct answer is ovulation. Okay, this is estrogen's up, endometrium is getting prepared. Ovulation is release of the egg, the oocyte. The structure that produces thin, milk-colored alkaline fluid that composes about 30% of semen volume is prostate gland, seminal vesicles. Seminal vesicles are on here twice, or seminiferous tubules. Seminiferous tubules. Well, this is kind of a weird question, but anyway, it's the prostate gland. Prostate gland is this. Seminal vesicles are about 60% of the fluid volume. That is that, I think, is what it was. And seminal vesicles are more of the fructose and all the nutrients that's needed to get them there. Milk colored alkaline fluid. We're talking about the prostate gland. And I think that is pretty much it for this. Yeah. So that's pretty much it for this. Again, I know that was fast paced, but stick with the big stuff. If I repeat myself about stuff, that's the stuff I would pay attention to. Promise you guys we'll have this test, no problem, on Monday. And then we'll just worry about reviewing for the final. Okay. But that final, in your course content, there's a final study guide that covers most everything you should see on the final. So I'd already should have been looking at a long time ago, but that's where it's at. If you look at it now. But I hope you guys have a great weekend. If you need me, I will not be available. I will get back to you Sunday night. If you email me or anything, I'll probably get back to it Sunday night. So anyway, I hope you guys have a good weekend. Again, study. Don't be too lazy, but also make sure and take some time for yourself. Get outside, spend a couple hours with your dog at the park, with your family at the park, something, get some fresh air, get rid of your cell phone. It's bad. We got to get rid of these cell phones sometimes. So go outside, take a break from the cell phone, be with your family, be with your friends for a couple hours, and take a break from studying. Okay. Encourage you with that. God bless you guys. I'll see you Monday. Okay.